Grady Carter stood in the parking lot, holding the keys to a worn-out 1930 Cadillac, never imagining the moment that was about to unfold. A wealthy white executive, David Miller, challenged him in front of everyone, turning a simple parking dispute into a public spectacle. Whispers rose, phones lifted, and the line between mockery and humiliation grew thin. No one expected the outcome, and even fewer were prepared for the truth this moment would expose. What happens when arrogance collides with quiet dignity? Comment and tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories. Grady Carter had spent decades quietly working in the background of a company that rarely acknowledged him. Each morning started the same, arriving before the sun, sweeping the long hallways, emptying bins, and fixing the small things no one else noticed. His presence blended into the rhythm of the building like part of its foundation. People passed him daily, offering nods that felt more like habit than recognition. Yet Grady carried himself with a calm steadiness, moving through each day with a quiet pride shaped by years of resilience. Outside work, his life was simple. He maintained his old 1930 Cadillac, a relic he had restored piece by piece over the years. It wasn't fast, and it didn't shine like the polished cars in the executive lot, but it held history, a reminder of where he came from and the patience it took to shape something into worth. That car had carried him through storms, struggles, and seasons of life most of his coworkers never knew he had lived through. On the day everything changed, Grady had finished his tasks early. The lot was unusually full, a crowd of guests visiting for an investor meeting. With no other space available, he parked his old Cadillac near the front, never imagining it would matter. But nearby eyes judged him the moment he stepped away from it. Snickers, smirks, and side comments followed, small reminders of how easily people dismissed him without knowing anything about him. Across the lot, David Miller arrived in his luxury car, carrying the confidence of a man used to attention. Employees stepped aside for him, the way people often moved for those who held unchecked power. But today, his routine halted the instant he saw Grady's dusty Cadillac sitting where his Ferrari usually dominated the space. A tightening silence washed over the lot, hinting at the confrontation and humiliation that was about to unfold. What began as an ordinary day for Grady was shifting into something no one could predict. The moment David Miller noticed the old Cadillac parked beside his prized Ferrari, the atmosphere in the lot shifted. A sense of irritation pulsed through him, fueled not just by the car's age or appearance, but by the fact that it belonged to someone he never considered worthy of standing at the same level as him. Employees gathering nearby sensed the tension rising, whispering among themselves as phones discreetly lifted to record what they knew would become a spectacle. Grady Carter remained calm, the same measured composure he carried through every hardship in life. But the stares aimed at him carried an old, familiar weight. It wasn't just about a parking space. It was about who they believed belonged in certain places and who they believed did not. That unspoken boundary had followed him his entire life, and right now it was being drawn in the asphalt beneath his feet. As David strutted around his Ferrari, he carried himself like a man performing for an audience he believed he owned. Investors and guests gathered around him, some amused, others uncomfortable, but no one willing to step between the growing divide. The simmering arrogance in the air only intensified as David stepped forward with a confidence that felt more like intimidation than authority. In front of a silent crowd, he pushed the moment further, elevating a simple inconvenience into a public test of dominance. And when he turned the parking dispute into a high-stakes challenge, people gasped, not because of the race itself, but because of who he chose to challenge. An older black man with a dusty antique car standing against a wealthy white executive with power, privilege, and a machine built to win. The imbalance was obvious to everyone watching. Still, Grady accepted quietly, not with bravado or theatrics, but with a steady breath that unsettled some of the bystanders more than any display of fear would have. It was the kind of calm that hinted at a history they did not see, a strength they never bothered to recognize. As the employees followed them to the far end of the lot, the anticipation thickened. Phones continued recording. Whispers grew sharper. Some laughed casually, expecting an easy victory for David. Others watched with a tension they couldn't fully explain, sensing that something about this moment carried more weight than a simple race. Grady opened the hood of his old Cadillac, adjusting small parts with the same care he'd always shown. Meanwhile, David paraded around his Ferrari, boasting about its speed, its design, its perfection, reminding everyone of the distance between what he believed himself to be and what he expected others to remain beneath. But beneath the noise and ego, something deeper stirred. For Grady, this wasn't about winning or proving anything dramatic. It was about facing yet another moment where a person with power chose to diminish him publicly, assuming he would shrink under the pressure. Instead, he stayed steady, letting patience become his strength. When the engines finally ignited, the energy snapped into focus. David's Ferrari roared fiercely, while Grady's Cadillac hummed quietly, prompting muffled laughter from those who expected nothing more than humiliation. The race began with a burst of speed from David, leaving most of the crowd confident, too confident about the outcome. But as Grady's slow, steady pace continued, a strange stillness settled over a few onlookers. Something about the way he focused forward, not on the crowd, not on the noise, hinted that this moment wasn't as predictable as it seemed. Halfway down the stretch, the crowd noticed something was wrong. The Ferrari's engine sputtered. A warning light blinked. A faint metallic smell drifted through the air. Confusion rippled through the spectators, their excitement turning to disbelief as the powerful machine stuttered toward silence. And as the Cadillac's steady hum approached from behind, the story took a turn no one had prepared for. A moment that began as mockery was transforming into something far more revealing, and the real impact of that shift was only beginning. The moment David's Ferrari rolled to a dead stop, silence washed through the crowd like a sudden gust. The powerful machine he flaunted so confidently now sat motionless in the center of the lot, its polished body gleaming under the sun like a monument to a pride that had finally cracked. David stepped out, shaken, sweat clinging to his forehead as if the heat had finally turned against him. For a man who thrived on control, nothing felt more suffocating than the reality unfolding around him. Behind him, the steady hum of Grady Carter's Cadillac grew louder. Slow, unbothered, constant. What once drew ridicule now carried an undeniable presence. The employees who had mocked the old car earlier stood frozen, their amusement fading into disbelief. For them, this wasn't just a stalled engine. It was a shift in the balance they had always taken for granted. As Grady approached, the weight of racial dynamics, unspoken yet deeply familiar, hung heavy in the air. A black janitor in a dusty antique car overtaking a wealthy white executive in front of investors and staff was something few had imagined seeing here. It wasn't just unexpected. It disrupted the hierarchy many had accepted without question, and in their widening eyes that disruption was unmistakable. Grady's Cadillac slowed beside the stalled Ferrari. Without theatrics, without satisfaction, he simply continued forward, offering the same calm presence he carried into every silent struggle life had handed him. Employees stared, realizing the humiliation David had tried to cast on Grady had reversed itself with a quiet force no one could ignore. The crowd rushed forward, recording the scene with frantic urgency. Every camera captured David's uneasy posture, the tension in his jaw, and the fear of knowing his moment of dominance had collapsed on a public stage. In contrast, Grady's calm expression reflected decades of enduring judgment, dismissal, and discrimination, yet rising above it without ever needing to shout. Then came the moment that cemented the turning point. David, stripped of his confidence, had no choice but to rely on the very man he tried to belittle. And Grady, with the same steady grace he'd shown since the morning began, continued toward the finish line with David beside him, forced to confront the symbolism of that slow, humbling ride. As the Cadillac crossed the line, whispers rippled through the crowd like a wave. Phones zoomed in on David's pale expression, his shirt damp from the heat of embarrassment rather than the sun. The investors watching from the sidelines realized this wasn't just a personal failure. This was a public revelation of character, hierarchy, and the prejudice that had fueled the entire confrontation. And while David struggled to regain composure, Grady stepped out quietly, carrying no triumph on his face, only the calm dignity of a man who had survived far harsher moments than this. The crowd held its breath, sensing that everything set in motion today was about to come crashing down in ways no one could stop. What happened next would expose more than a broken car. It would expose the truth behind the man who drove it. As the dust settled around the finish line, the weight of what had happened pressed heavily on everyone watching. David Miller tried to regain control of the moment, but the cameras captured everything. The arrogance, the collapse, and the uncomfortable truth behind it all. His investors no longer looked impressed. They saw a man who had turned insecurity into humiliation and targeted someone he assumed would remain silent beneath him. Grady Carter stood quietly, the same way he had throughout the entire ordeal. He didn't seek applause, validation, or revenge. His presence alone spoke louder than any confrontation could. Years of resilience had taught him that dignity didn't need volume. It needed consistency. And in that moment, the entire company saw the difference between power built on respect and power built on ego. The leadership quickly stepped in, recognizing the seriousness of what had unfolded. The issue was no longer about a parking space or a stalled car. It was about the deeper prejudice that allowed a man in authority to belittle someone he believed was beneath him. The ripple effect was undeniable. Conversations began, quiet at first, then louder, about workplace culture, fairness, and the racism that often hides beneath casual arrogance. Grady didn't linger to witness the fallout. He returned to his old Cadillac, brushing dust from the seat with the same care he began his mornings with. To him, this moment wasn't a victory. It was a reminder of the quiet battles faced by people who work hard, stay steady, and still get overlooked because of the color of their skin. Yet this time, the world had seen the truth unfold in real time, captured by 100 phones and shared beyond the company walls. The story spread far beyond the parking lot, resonating with people who had lived through similar moments of dismissal and bias. It wasn't about a race, it wasn't about a car. It was about how easily dignity can be challenged and how powerful it becomes when it stands unshaken. And the question that lingered long after the cameras stopped was simple. How many more moments like this must happen before respect becomes the rule and not the exception? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And make sure you subscribe to Black Community Struggles for more powerful stories about justice, truth, and our community's fight to be seen.